Right now we are inside of Berl-Berl, which is a virtual environment. It's a digital swamp, and it's an instrument and a song, and it exists inside of the very iconic Halle am Berghain that used to be a nightclub in Berlin that has now been transformed into this kind of musical resurrection of past songs and folklores about swamps in Berlin and Europe in general. So Berl-Berl is made from hundreds of individual rocks, leaves, mushrooms, birds, and some extinct beetles from the Natural History Archive in Berlin. And all the different plants and everything that we see on the screens, I have digitized with a 3D scanner by using a canoe through the wetlands around Berlin. So I've been going out together with biologists here, and they've showed me different things in the landscape that they find very emotional or something that's very personally captivating to them rather than just scientific. And this became the base material for what you see on the screens. And then what you see on the screens is changing all the time. It's kind of like a living digital environment, and the environment is changing all the sounds in the building. So the whole building becomes this big instrument. So when I was creating the work, I was actually visiting a lot of cathedrals and looking at how a cathedral is this big building that tells a story about the heavens, about nature, about the world, but it's also a place where a human voice can occupy the whole building, and it can become kind of like an instrument. So what we're seeing and hearing in here is this virtual environment and sounds from the swamps around Berlin combined with vocals from the singer Aka. When I first entered Backhand, I was thinking, okay, how do I occupy this space as an artist? And you kind of have two choices working with these kind of immersive environments. One is to take over the building and hide it, so you can create images on every surface. But I choose to do the opposite and kind of respecting the history of the building itself, because it's a very iconic building in Berlin. It means a lot to people here as a nightclub, but it can no longer be a nightclub because of COVID. So it's a building that's changing, it's transforming how we are, how we connect to each other in Berlin. So I wanted to embrace that kind of musicality of the building itself. So when I first entered here, I started whistling and clapping. And I noticed that there was this big echo in the space. This is a 7-second echo. And I found it really interesting. So even though I work as a digital artist, we think about the digital often as screens, but really the virtual is a 3-dimensional world. You can move across all different axes. And sound is this kind of invisible mass that you can feel with your body. Things behind you, things moving around you, things moving up and down. So rather than focusing only on screens, I choose to really elaborate on sound inside of the architecture. So there are 3 different sound systems at place that play at the same time and react to what we see in the screens. It's like a big sound, which is the global sound system. So when the virtual swamp is changing time of day, if it's night, if it's early in the morning, or if it's raining, if it's misty, the global sound of the whole building will change. So you can hear the weather really far away and it moves around, or like thunder and different things. And this is like the global system. And then there's a middle system, which is like, this is a pretty big space. It's 1,400 square meters. So I created 5 different zones, individual kind of zones within the space. And when you first see it, you can't really perceive these zones, but once you move through it, you can hear it. So there are sounds that are about 20 meters long, and they occupy these kind of middle realms in the space. Like if there's a tree, you can hear the tree. If there's a bird, you can hear the bird, but you can only hear it there. And then there are very intimate sounds, where if you walk up to a speaker or a column or the wall, there are sounds that you can only hear within like 1 to 3 meters. So there are 3 layers of sounds that changes as you move through the building. And then there's the voice of Arka, the singer that I work with, that occupy all 3 sounds. So her voice can travel from the whole building, and it can like spin around you in the building, or it can come out just very intimately in a little corner. So there are these 3 different sound levels playing all at the same time. There are 2 reasons for me working with nature and environments. One is that there are a lot of natural histories that we have forgotten. So all of the different cultures in Europe are founded on wetlands and swamps, but we have kind of forgotten this history. So since the 1700s, most cities in Europe have paved over and removed all of our wetlands, and this is why we now have drought. It's why we have floodings. It's why we have troubles with rising waters, because wetlands is a type of landscape that can regulate the environment. So we have kind of ruined the thing that we actually originate from, the wetlands. So that's kind of the natural history that I'm working with here in Berlin, because the word Berlin comes from the Slavic word Berl, which means swamp. So there were many cultures and languages in the past around Berlin, and they all had different words for the area, and they all meant swamp. So Berlin actually means swamp. So I'm kind of reviving this sensibility and perspective on the landscape as a swamp here. So that's one thing, like working with nature, working with natural history, but then I try to pair it with something very emotional, something more human, like a kind of zeitgeist, something that I feel, something I'm feeling, and that I kind of guess that other people are feeling. So when I was working on Berl-Berl, I have a lot of collaborators. I have Aka, there's a sound artist, Matt McCorkle, Lou O'Neill, another sound artist, and a team of programmers. But we all had to collaborate individually because there was a hard lockdown in Berlin. So I started to think, how can I make something that makes us feel connected, even though we are in different places? And the swamp is a really good landscape for this, because it's like this morphing, undefinable location. It's hard to say exactly what a swamp is. So I started to build out the virtual landscape. I go to the forest, I 3D scan plants, and I start to build a virtual landscape. And then slowly, I invite the other collaborators to occupy this landscape. I sent them images, I sent them videos. I even built a virtual reality replication of the exhibition that everybody can log into from different countries and places. So I built kind of a world that I felt everybody who worked on it could feel connected to, and everybody participating had a lot of freedom. So I created little stories for everybody I work with, and I send it to them and they respond to it. So that's the wetland history, but that's also just the story of how to collaborate and feel connected emotionally with other people, even though we are apart. So I've kind of worked with this theme of big technology and big building, something like operatic or epic, and something very close, something very intimate or like textured and detailed. So there's a lot of softness in the work, in the way Aka sings. It's like very personal, soft, and kind of long vocals to kind of soften up the space and play with these different contrasts. That's a duality. Yeah, so I grew up, in a kind of digital age, which has felt very fractured. You have the internet, you have video games, you can connect with everybody everywhere. But then once the lockdown happened, because of COVID, I was retained, to one location. So I rediscovered like a kind of emotional connection to what's hyperlocal. So for the past 2 years, I've been exploring formations in nature that's right in front of you, but that you rarely think about. So in my past works, I've worked with more like exotic places, extinct iconic birds, a sinking tropical island, a volcano. But this time I've chosen to look at the overlooked landscape. which is the wetland, the swamp, the things that are right in front of us everywhere in Denmark and Germany, in Europe, really all over the world. Any big civilization is actually founded near a wetland because it's what creates fresh water. And we've forgotten this. So I've been paying attention now to this hyperlocal while working with quite big industrial technologies. We use video game technology, we have servers, we use like AI, we use a lot of pretty big tools, but I try to make them very personal and soften them to make it very human again. And this fits also with paying attention to things that are just like right beneath your foot in the ground and kind of really paying attention to it in quite extreme detail. So in here is like the largest screen is 14 meters, but it can zoom in on these like mushrooms, and on the ground they're like this big, but on the screen suddenly they're 14 meters large. So once you work with these virtual tools and you create something quite cinematic, it means that you can control cameras and perspectives in ways that hasn't been possible in the past. Because a video camera can't just infinitely travel through a landscape and film from all different angles, but you can do this virtually. So you can create these new perspectives on nature. In my past work, I primarily focused on natural history and landscapes. But now, with this project, I both collaborated with the Natural History Museum in Berlin and their scientist, but I also collaborated with another artist in Sutherland in the UK, and he was researching with me past mythologies, songs and words that were used in the past in this whole region to describe the rivers, the trees, the plants. So it's the first time that I'm kind of embracing an extinct, more like language or human perspective on nature. So this has become a new element in my work. It's to work with like songs and folklore and reviving something much more abstract, which is emotion and perspective, a way of navigating a place, which is really kind of abstract to think about, where it's more tangible to say, I want to revive an extinct bird. There's a tangible element, but now I'm trying to revive a sensibility of what it means to live and be part of the swamp as a human, which is quite abstract. I primarily, with this artwork, want people to feel differently about wetlands and swamps. So feel a kind of deep emotional connection to the landscape and a kind of fascination. So when I created the work, I actually work with a lot of theories of hypnosis. So there's like a 30-minute loop in the work, but every loop will always be different. So it's infinite. So there's this repetition and rhythm to it, a lot of music, but it will always be different every time you see and hear it. It's repetition and change. So I try to get into people's mind and make them kind of part of the landscape. So people usually spend between like 1 and 3 hours in here, and they lie down. They like, several visitors come many times because there's this kind of emotional connection to it that I try to focus on. It's like I want people to be inspired and feel connected to the swamp.